Stephen P. Jobs, the visionary co-founder of Apple, who helped usher in the era of personal computer and led a cultural transformation in the way music, movies, and mobile communication were expanded in the digital age. That Wednesday, he was 56. The death was announced by Apple. The company Mr. Jobs and his high school friend Steven Wozniak started in 1976 in a suburban California garage. A friend of the family said the cause was complication of pancreatic cancer. Mr. Jobs was whacked along a public struggle with the disease, remaining the face of the company even he has underwent treatments. Introducing new products for a global market in his trademaker blue jeans even as he grew gaunt and frail. He underwent surgery in 2004, received a liver transplant in 2009, and took 3 medical leaves of absence as Apple chief executive before stepping down in August and turning over the helmet to Timothy D. Cook, the chief operating officer. When he left, he was still engaged in the company's affairs, negotiating with another Silicon Valley executive only a week earlier. I have always said that if there ever come a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know, Mr. Jobs said in a letter released by the company. Unfortunately, that day has come. By then, having mastered digital technology and capitalized on his intuitive marketing sense, Mr. Jobs had largely come to define the personal computer industry and an array of digital consumer and entertainment business centered on the internet. He had also become a very rich man, worth an estimated £8.3 billion. Tributes to Mr. Jobs flowed weekly on Wednesday evening, in formal statement and in the flow of social networks, with President Obama, technology industry leaders, and legends of Apple fans weighing in. For those of us lucky enough to get to work with Steve, it's been an insanely great honor, said Bill Gates, the Microsoft co-founder. I will miss Steve immensely. A Twitter user named Matt Galligan wrote, "Rip Steve Jobs. You touch an ugly world of technology and made it beautiful." 8 years after founding Apple, Mr. Jobs led the team that designed Macintosh computer, a breakthrough in making personal computer easier to use. After a 12 years separation from the company, prompted by a bitter falling out with his chief executive John Sculley, he returned in 1997 to oversee the creation of one innovative digital device after another, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad. This transformed not only product categories like music player and cell phones, but also entire industries like music and mobile communication. During these years outside Apple, he bought a tiny computer graphic spin-off from the director George Lucas and built a team of computer scientists, artists, and animators that became Pixar Animator Studios. Starting with Toy Story in 1995, Pixar produced a string of hit movies, won several Academy Awards for academic and technological excellence, and made the full-length computer-animated film a mainstream art for enjoying by children and adults worldwide. Mr. Jobs was neither a hardware engineer nor a software programmer, nor did he think of himself as a manager. He considered himself a technology leader, choosing the best people possible, encouraging and applauding them, and making the final call on product design. It was an executive style that had involved, in his early year at Apple, his meddling in tiny details maddened colleagues, and his criticism could be causes and ever humiliating, but he grew to elect extraordinary loyalty. He was the most passionate leader one could hope for, a motivating force without parallel, wrote Stephen Levy, author of the 1994 book Insanely Great, which chronicles the creation of the Mac. Tom Sawyer could have picked up tricks from Steve Jobs. Toy Story, for example, took 4 years to make while Pixar struggled. Yet Mr. Jobs never let on his colleagues. You need a lot more than vision. You need a stubbornness, tenacity, birth, and patience to stay course, said Edwin Catmull, a computer scientist and co-founder of Pixar. In Steve's case, he pushed it right to the edge to try to make the next big step forward. Mr. Jobs was the ultimate arbiter of Apple products, and his standards were exacting. Over the course of of the year, he tossed out 2 Apple prototypes, for example, before approving the third and began shipping it in June 2007. To his understanding of technology, he brought an immersion in popular culture. In his 20s, he dated Joan Baez. Ella Fitzgerald sang at his 13th birthday party. His worldwide was shaped by the 60s counterculture in the San Francisco Bay Area, where he had grown up, the adopted son of Silicon Valley machinist. When he graduated from high school in Cupertino in 1972, he said the very strongest scent of the 1960s was still there. After dropping out of Reed College, a stronghold of liberal thought in Portland, in 1972, Mr. Jobs led a countercultural lifestyle himself. He told a reporter that taking LSD was one of the 2 or 3 most important things he had done in his life. He said that there were things about him, the people who had not tried psychedelics, even people who even him well, including his wife, could never understand. Decades later, he flew around the world in his own corporate jet, but he maintained emotional ties to the period in which he grew up. He often felt like an outsider in the corporate world, he said. When discussing the Silicon Valley lasting contribution to humanity, he mentioned in the same breath the intention of the microchip and the World Earth Catalog, a 1960s countercultural publication. Apple's very name reflects his unconventionality. In an era when engineers and hobbyists tend to describe their machines with models number, he chose the name of a fruit, supposedly because of his dietary habits at the time. Coming on the scene just as computing began to move beyond the walls of research laboratories and corporations in the 1970s, Mr. Jobs saw that computing was becoming personal. They could do more than crunch numbers and solve scientific and business problems, and that it could even be a force for social and economic change. And at a time when hobbyist computers were boxy, wanted affair with metal chassis, he designed the Apple II as sleek, low-slug plastic packages intended for the den or the kitchen. He saw offering not just products but digital lifestyle. He put much stock in the notion of taste, a word he used frequently. It was a sensibility that shone in products that looked like works of art and delight users. Great products, he said, were a triumph of taste, of trying to expose yourself to the best things humans have done and then trying to bring those things into what you are doing. Regis McKenna, a long-time Silicon Valley marketing executive to whom Mr. Jobs interned in the late 1970 to help shape the Apple brand, said Mr. Jobs' genius lay in his ability to simplify complex, highly engineered products, to strip away the excess layers of business design and innovation until only the simple, elegant reality remained. Mr. Jobs' own research and intuition and not focus groups were his guide. When asked what market research went into the iPad, Mr. Jobs replied, "No, it's not the consumer's job to know what they want." Stephen Paul Jobs was born in San Francisco on February 24, 1955, and surrendered for adoption by his biological parents, Joanne Carol Shelby and Abdel Fattah Jandali, a graduate student from Syria who became a political science professor. He was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs. The elder Mr. Jobs worked in finance and real estate before returning to his original trade as a machinist, moved his family down the San Francisco Peninsula to Mountain View and then to Los Alamos in the 1960s. Mr. Jobs developed an early interest in electronics. He was mentored by a neighbor, an electronics hobbyist, who built a do-it-yourself electronics project. He was brash from an early age. As an eighth grader, after discovering that a crucial part was missing from a frequency counter he was assembling, he telephoned William Hewlett, the co-founder of Hewlett-Packard. Mr. Hewlett spoke with the boy for 20 minutes, prepared a bag of parts for him to pick up, and offered him a job as a summer intern. Mr. Job met Mr. Wozniak while attending Olmsted High School in neighboring Cupertino. The two took an introductory electronics class there. The spark that ignited their partnership was provided by Mr. Wozniak's mother. Mr. Wozniak was graduated from high school and enrolled at University of California, Berkeley, when she sent him an article from the October 1971 issue of Esquire magazine. The article Secret of the Little Blue Box by Ron Rosenbaum detailed an underground hobbyist culture of young men known as phone pranks who were illicitly exploring the nation's phone system. Mr. Wozniak shared the article with Mr. Jobs, and the two set out to track down an elusive figure identified in the article as Captain Crunch. The man had taken the name from his discovery that Weasel, the came in the box of camped Crunch, was turned to a frequency that made it possible to make free long-distance calls simply by blowing the whistle next to the phone headset. Captain Crunch was John Draper, a former Air Force electronic technician, and finding him took several weeks. Learning that the two young hobbyists were searching for him, Mr. Draper had arranged to come to Mr. Wozniak's Berkeley dormitory room. Mr. Jobs, who was still in high school, had traveled to Berkeley for the meeting. When Mr. Draper arrived, he entered the room saying simply, "It is I." Based on information they granted from Mr. Draper, Mr. Wozniak and Mr. Jobs later collaborated on building and selling blue blocks, devices that are widely used for making free and illegal phone calls. They raised a total of $6,000 for the effort. After enrolling at Reed College in 1972, Mr. Jobs left after one semester, but remained in Portland for another 18 months, auditing classes. In a commencement address given at Stanford in 2005, he said he had decided to leave college because it was consuming all of his part-time savings. Leaving school, however, also freed his curiosity to follow his interest. "I didn't have a dorm room," he said in his Stanford speech, "so I slept on the floors in friends' room. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposit to buy food with, and I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I love it, and much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out success later on." He returned to Silicon Valley in 1974 and took a job there as a technician at Atari, the video game manufacturer. Still researching for his calling, he left after several months and traveled to India with colleague friends Daniel Kottke, who would later become an early Apple employee. Mr. Jobs returned to Atari that fall. In 1975, he and Mr. Wozniak, then working as an engineer at HP, began attending meetings of Homebrew Computing Club, a hobbyist group that met at the Stafford Linear Accelerator Center in Menlo Park, Calif. Personal computing had been pioneer at research laboratories adjacent to Stanford, and it was spreading to the outside world. "What I remember is how intense it looked," said Lee Feinstein, a computer designer who was a homebrew member. "He was everywhere, and he seemed to try to hear everything people had to say. Mr. Wozniak designed the original Apple I computer simply to show it off to his friends at the home brew. It was Mr. Jobs who had the inspiration that it could be a commercial product. In early 1976, he and Mr. Wozniak, using their own money, began Apple with an initial investment of $1,300. They later gained the backing of a former Intel executive, A.C. Markula, who lent them $250,000. Mr. Wozniak would be the technical half and Mr. Jobs the marketing half of the original Apple I computer. Starting out in the Jobs family garage in Los Altos, they moved the company to a small office in Cupertino shortly thereafter. In April 1977, Mr. Jobs and Mr. Wozniak introduced Apple II at the West Coast Computer Fair in San Francisco. It created a sensation, faced with a gaggle of small and large competitors in the emerging computer market. Apple, with this Apple II, had figured out a way to study the business and consumers market to building a computer that could be customized for specific applications. Sales skyrocketed from $2 million in 1977 to $600 million in 1981. The years the company went public. By 1983, Apple was in the fortune no company had ever joined the list so quickly. The Apple III, introduced in May 1980, was intended to dominate the desktop computer market. IBM would not introduce its original personal computer until 1981, but the Apple III had a host of technical problems, and Mr. Jobs shifted his focus to a new and ultimately short-lived project, an office workstation computer codenamed Lisa. By then, Mr. Jobs had made his much chrono-liked 1979 the Xerox Research Center in Palo Alto, where he saw the Auto, an experimental personal computer system that foreshowed modern desktop computing. The Auto, controlled by a mouse pointing service device, was one of the first computer to employ a graphical video display, which presented the user with a view of documents and programs, adopting the metaphor of an office desktop. It was one of those sorts of apocalyptic moments. Mr. Jobs said of his visit in 1995 oral history interview from the Smithsonian Institution. I remember within 10 minutes of seeing the graphical user interface stuff, just knowing that every computer would work this way someday. It was so obvious once you saw it. It didn't require tremendous intellect, it was so clear. In 1981, he joined a small group of Apple engineers pursuing a separate project, a lower-cost system codenamed Macintosh. The machine was introduced in January 1984 and trumpeted during the Super Bowl telecast by a 60-second commercial directed by Ridley Scott that linked IBM, then the dominant PC maker, with Orwell Big Brother. Earlier, Mr. Jobs had lured Mr. Scott to Apple to be its chief executive, a former Pepsi Cola chief executive. Mr. Shuley was impressed by Jobs' pitch. Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugar water, or do you want to change the world? We went on to help. Mr. Jobs introduced a number of new computer models, including an advanced version of Apple II and later the Lisa and Macintosh desktop computers. Through them, Mr. Jobs popularized the graphical user interface, which, based on a mouse pointing device, would become the starter way to control computers. But then the Lisa failed commercially and early Macintosh sales proved disappointing. The two men became estranged and a power struggle ensued, and Mr. Jobs lost control of Lisa project. The board ultimately stripped him of his operational role, taking control of the Lisa project away from him, and Apple employees were laid off. He left Apple in 1985. "I don't wear the right kind of pants to run his company," he told a small garage of Apple employees before he left, according to the member of original Macintosh development team. He was barefoot as he spoke and wearing blue jeans. That September, he announced a new venture, Nexus Inc. The aim was to build a workstation computer for their education market. The next year, the Texas industry 8 Ross Perot invested $20 million in there, but it didn't achieve Mr. Jobs' goal. Mr. Jobs also established a personal philanthropic foundation after leaving Apple, but soon had a change of heart, deciding instead to spend much of his fortune, $10 million, on acquiring Pixar, a struggling graphics supercomputing company owned by filmmaker George Lucas. The purchase was a significant gamble. There was little market at the time for computer animated movies, but the change in 1995 when the company with Walt Disney Pictures realized Toy Story. That film box office receipts ultimately surged, and when Pixar went public in a record-breaking offering, Mr. Jobs emerged a billionaire. In 2006, the Walt Disney Company agreed to purchase Pictures £7.4 billion. The sale made Mr. Jobs Disney's largest single shareholder, with about 7% of company stock. His personal life also became more public. He had a number of well-published romantic relationships, including one with the folk singer John Baez, before marrying Lauren Powell. In 1996, his sister Mona Simpson, a novelist, threat speaking on her relationship with Steve Jobs in the novel A Regular Guy. The two did not meet until they were adults. The novel centered on Silicon Valley entrepreneur who bore a close resemblance to Mr. Jobs. It was not entirely flattering portrait. Mr. Jobs said about a quarter of it was accurate. "We are a family," said of Mr. Simpson in an interview with the New York Times magazine. "She's one of my best friends in the world. I call her and talk to every couple days." His wife and Mr. Simpson surviving, as do his 3 children with Mr. Powell, his daughter Evie Jobs, and Erin Sienna Jobs, and a son, Reed. Another daughter, Lisa Brennan Jobs, from a relationship with Christian Brenner, and another sister, Patty Jobs. Eventually, Mr. Jobs refocused next from the education to the business market had to drop the hardware part of the company, deciding to sell just an operating system, although Next became just a significant computer industry player. It had a huge impact. A young programmer, Tim Berners-Lee, used Next machinery to develop the first version of the World Wide Web and Swiss physics research sent to in 1997, after unsuccessful effort to develop a next-generation operating system, Apple, with Gilbert Amelia now his commander, required Next from $430 million. The next year, Mr. Jobs returned to Apple as an advisor. He becomes chief executive again in 2000. Shortly after returning, Mr. Jobs published and Apple long feud with his rival Microsoft, which agreed to continue developing its Office software for the Macintosh and invested in Apple. Once in control of Apple again, Mr. Jobs set out to reshape the consumer electronics industry, published the company into the digital music business, introducing first iTunes, and then an iPod MP3 player. The music arm grew rapidly, reaching almost 50% of the company revenue in 2008. In 2005, Mr. Jobs announced that he would end Apple business relationship with IBM and Motorola and build Macintosh computers based on Intel processors. His fight with cancer was not public now. Apple had announced in 2004 that Mr. Jobs had a rare but curable form of pancreatic cancer and that he had undergone successful surgery. 4 years later, questioned about his health returned when he appeared at a company event looking out. Afterward, he said he had suffered from a common bug. Privately, he said his cancer surgery had created these problems, but instead they were not life-threatening. Apple began selling the iPhone in June 2007. By Jobs' goal was to sell 10 million of the handset in 2008, equivalent to 1% of the global cell phone market. The company sells 11.6 million. Although smartphones were already commonplace, the iPhone dispensed stylus and pioneers a touchscreen and set the standard for the mobile computing marketing. Rolled out with much anticipation and fanfare, iPhone rocked to popularity. By the end of 2010, the company had sold almost 90 million units. Although Mr. Jobs took just a normal $1 when he refunded to Apple, his sensation became the source of a Silicon Valley scandal in 2006. Over backing of millions of shares of stock opinions, but after a company investigation and one by a Circus Engage Commission was found that no had benefited financially from the backing and no charges were brought. The episode did little tame Mr. Jobs standing the business and technology world. As the gravity of his illness became known, and particularly after he announced he was stepping down, he was increasingly hailed for his genuine and true achievements. His ability to blend products, design, and business market innovation by integrating customer-oriented software, electronic components in the industrial design a new business strategy in a way that was not min-matched. If we had a motto, it may have come from the Whole Earth catalog, which he said had deeply influenced him as a man. He said in his confirmation address at Stanford in 2005, and with the admonition, stay hungry, stay full.